I'm going to be talking about the relationship between research and advocacy. So I think I'll start off by talking about our theory of change at Trust Africa. Briggs has really talked about it, so I'll just whiz through it. At Trust Africa, we work through 4 interrelated strategic pillars: capacity strengthening, knowledge generation, technical assistance, and empowered citizens. But before I do that, we all know about Trust Africa, right? We started off as the Special Initiative for Africa in the Ford Foundation as a program, 2001. At that time, The Economist had just run this article for all of us. I think most of us remember that one, with a malnourished child holding an AK-47, Africa, the hopeless continent. It was a time of pessimism around the future of the continent. And also it was a time of sort of a deeper questioning about the interventions that were taking place on the continent, led by both official development assistance and also private philanthropy. And within the Ford Foundation at that time, there was a core group of Africans who were heading the Lagos office, South Africa office, Cairo office, who got together and also were brave enough to speak to their bosses literally to say, we are also part of the problem as foundations in Africa. What Africa needs is an African foundation that is led by Africans, that convenes Africans, and also is driven by Africans in terms of agenda setting. So to cut a long story short, it led to the Special Initiative for Africa that was housed within Ford Foundation for up until 2006, when it became Trust Africa and was now based in Dakar, Senegal. We are still, operationally, our head office is still in Dakar, Senegal. That's where I'm based. And also we have presence across what we call the major hubs, East, Southern, and West Africa. We have presence in Nairobi, we have presence here in Zimbabwe, we have presence in Lagos and Liberia. So at Trust Africa, we really cherish and we really believe that the continent can change once you've contributed towards building a mass movement that can be a catalyst for lasting social change. And in that building of that sort of mass movement, we look at the issues to do with capacity strengthening. But for this meeting, we look at the issues to do with knowledge generation, technical assistance, and also hopefully leading towards empowered citizens. And there are certain assumptions that we make about policy. I think this is public policy making 101. The first one being issue identification, the clarity that we have on the problem to be solved, the clarity that is needed for the problem to be solved. Then we also need to have a discussion on what kind of knowledge do we need in clarifying the problem and also in formulating alternatives. And also, I'm just using it as a linear process, crafting of a comprehensive policy alternative that resolves the problems that we have. Once you have that linear assumption, you are making an assumption that there's a relationship between research and policy making. I think researchers in the room want to be that comfortable to make that assumption that once they produce whatever research from the field, etc., that it will be taken up by policymakers and incorporated into policy. But from experience and across the board, not only around this issue of illicit financial flows, but other issue areas that we have looked at, there exists a real disconnect between policy making and the use of considerable data or reports that policy researchers generate. And some of it is actually not the fact that government is unaware of it, but government is not politically motivated to utilize that, or there are actually bigger political forces or even donor interests that are pushing for a certain position. So half the time, governments do not necessarily formulate and implement policies just because they are the best policies on the ground, given the research that has been carried out, etc. So most of the research that we have, Sam, it's gathering up dust. And the challenge is to say, how do you get that research to be used? In fact, in many cases, policymaking then tends to be very ad hoc in nature, driven either by political or donor interests. Also, what we have is the limited platforms that are inclusive of governments, multilateral institutions, African civil society organizations for problem identification and consensus building on how to resolve those issues. What we have also is public policy issues are increasingly becoming very complex, yeah, especially within the globalized system that we work in. And we also notice, like Masego was talking about, that the focus that we have had, which is sort of a limited focus, especially in the corruption debates, around focusing on the state, while at least you are not looking at international systems and also how the state itself is actually a victim of the manner in which it has been inserted within global processes, especially around the governance of financial systems, around investments, opening up the economies, etc. So you find that especially when we're beginning to discuss trade agreements, illicit financial flows, the state is no longer necessarily the locus of resource or even of policy making. If you just focus all your advocacy or your research at that level, you miss the bigger challenges that we have in the globalized system. Then also, we then move on to the link between policy research and advocacy. So the increased complexities in global financial circuits, economic production, have also stretched not only the response of the state, but even African civil society. So you'll notice, and I was also privy to the debate between Patrick and Khadija, which was very interesting. And what I picked up was, and I don't want to put words into Patrick's mouth because he's going to come and speak for himself, but what I picked up was one of the issues that he was raising, which was important, even the agenda around illicit financial flows. Where was it coming from? So that the lack of leadership amongst African civil society organizations, especially think tanks, in terms of defining the agenda or defining, sort of understanding the problem and beginning to identify solutions. It's something that we found that when we entered into the IFF space, we were already behind because Global Financial Integrity and others in the Global North had done a lot of work in terms of sort of opening this up. But they were opening it up in a limited way. I'll show it later on. So what we're beginning to find is the need, besides just carrying out research, but the need for real alliances or solidarity networks between Global South progressive forces and Global North progressive forces, so that we come to a place whereby we broaden and radicalize the agenda beyond the narrow agendas that we have, especially around IFF and its link with tax justice, to begin to broaden it to the issues that Patrick is raising. But you see, what we do not have a shortage of as African civil society or just as Africans in this space for socio-economic justice. Our struggle is that we have a longer period of struggle from the 1940s. So here I just summarized the kind of struggles that we have gone through. Struggles against colonialism, inadequate models of economic development, etc. So these are the struggles for, I would say, political independence, the nationalist movement, then the struggles against structural adjustment, and the Jubilee movement and Drop the Debt, and the post-independence winds of change democracy. The reason why I'm listing these is because there's an aspiration within the Stop the Bleeding campaign, as enunciated by Briggs and his colleagues, to come up with a proper African campaign that is beyond small rooms like these, that goes to begin to speak to the present realities of Africans at a very basic level, to begin to link IFFs with social development, to begin to link IFF with health delivery, IFF with education delivery, etc. So the challenge is to say, how do we get to that tipping point where it becomes so popular that you don't need to be mobilizing people in rooms like this, but you're at Africa Unity Square? Because I think this is where the struggle has to go to. If we are really saying that IFFs is the challenge that we are facing, is the challenge of the current decade, that if resolved can help us propel Africa to another level of development. So, but what we are lacking or what we need is to then locate IFFs within the broader discourse of Africa's development. So at the moment, and I say this respectfully because Ndikumana is here, and he's one of the sort of the original framers of this discourse, I think the current formulations of IFFs, although they expose a huge injustice, they are limiting in terms of how then they define the problem and even the solutions thereof. Because it's looked at as a technical challenge, maybe around tax regimes, around weak states, regulation capacity, and also misbehavior of a certain type of MNCs or private corporations that are working in collaboration with the comprador elite. But we do not take the historical forms of how Africa is inserted, or even just the global south, like Sam would want to put it. The global south has been inserted unfairly within the global circuits of capitalism. The manner in which the political economy of production in itself, before you even talk about revenue flows, just the ownership is already problematic, especially of our extractive resources, agriculture, the land grabs, etc. When you begin to look at it from that broader perspective, you realize that IFFs are just one of the issues that we have, that we are struggling with, given the current model of global accumulation. And we begin to say that we need a broader response, because the challenge with illicit financial flows, we don't want to make it sound like it's the silver bullet that will transform Africa once it's resolved. But it's part of the set of problems that we're facing. And I think as researchers, this is very important for us to really pay attention to understand the broader functions of our global capitalism and how Africa is inserted, and also the manner in which multinationals that are operating in Africa are extracting resources in their relationship with the African states through tax holidays, etc., and other regimes that exist. So the response that we have so far from other sectors is to say we need to reform or to improve revenue collection systems, but we do not confront head-on neoliberalism as shaped through the Washington Consensus, especially the opening up of borders and allowing the movement of money. It's one of the issues that we really need to deal with when we're talking about IFFs. So we need also, we need to be thinking about policy alternatives. We have been tinkering with, and others have sort of come back and said it's narrower, around local content. How do we broaden participation of local actors in value chains? How do we ensure that Africa is not exporting primary commodities? How do we ensure mineral beneficiation? How do we increase economic integration, regional trade amongst African states, to sort of as a counter to illicit financial flows? One of the drivers of illicit financial flows is the type of exports that we have, because they are mostly primary goods that we do not have time, or we do not have the opportunity to add value and to determine their price. So I think so I'm just sort of throwing things at the researchers that are gathered here. And also the research should help us frame new approaches or methods for local accumulation, and also reinserting the state within the economy. Because what we have had since structural adjustment programs is this removal of the state. And we have this discourse that has been going on for years now around the developmental state. I think there is that relationship to begin to say, how do we rethink the state, given the challenges that we have with not only IFFs, but the manner in which the economies are being organized around supporting or enhancing private accumulation. So given those challenges, we then ask ourselves, what are the new campaign issue areas for and research? First of all, I think, let me say, the relationship between research and advocacy should not be taken for granted, because in many times it does not exist as well. Researchers are sitting in their offices, generating whatever research reports that they have, and it ends up either by uploading on your website or preparing a report and distributing. Advocacy organizations, when they get a grant from Trust Africa, from OSISA, they commission their own consultants to generate research that is already generated somewhere. So we have this unending cycle where we're not having a place whereby researchers and advocates can meet. Because I think there are certain organizations that will tell you that they do everything, but you're always going to have a specialty in something. You're going to be stronger in something. So what we have found is there are certain organizations that Briggs has mapped as advocacy organizations, and others that he has mapped as think tanks and research organizations. And the challenge is to say, how do we facilitate a dialogue and a collaboration within those institutions? So some of the issue areas that we need to really look at. So there are new financial justice issues that are just as complex around our trade agreements, fair and pro-developing nations tax regimes. I believe, JJ, you'll correct me, Addis did not happen the way we expected it. Around this, how do we make sure that we have pro-developing nations tax regimes, and also these struggles against illicit financial flows? And how do we make sure that these seemingly technical subjects begin to speak to and address issues to do with inequality, restructuring the global economy to give the global south what I'm calling a chance. And also, I think, and I stand corrected by others, I think we need a new multidisciplinary approach, new multidisciplinary tools of research that inform the advocacy message and policy asks. So there's need, I argue, there's need for African-based solid analysis and tracking of the vast amounts of data to begin to come up, because I know in this room there's a debate about the methods, et cetera, about tracking illicit financial flows, what is illicit, but how much is Africa losing. I think it's good that we have researchers, and I think it's good to explore that, but we should not lose ourselves only in that. And there's also need to think through of how we can collect data. Because half the time maybe we're trying to collect data that has already been collected and sitting in some archive. And also researchers, I was hoping that Briggs, one of the teams here will be colleagues coming from the legal side to begin to think about new corporate governance frameworks, especially around taxation and also the manner in which these tax holidays are organized, investment regimes, etc. Then also, I think, and this is very important for me, linking Africa Rising with historical aspirations, because I think we've limited our ambition to a very narrow GDP-based kind of growth. And it's actually ahistorical, because our Pan-Africanism and even our African Renaissance that comes in the 1990s speaks of a more comprehensive form of development than what we are trying to do in the post-2000s, especially around just measuring GDP. So illicit financial flows should not only be tracking the money that we're losing, but should also be giving us a cost-benefit analysis around the social losses, what we are losing in terms of social policy interventions that the state could have made if we had sort of managed to stop the bleeding. So how do we move the IFF issue into a popular campaign? Briggs and his colleagues have come up with the Stop the Bleeding campaign to end illicit financial flows from Africa. Like I said, I think the tipping point is when this is not discussed in workshops, in rooms like this, but when it's discussed at a place like Africa Unity Square, Tahrir Square, etc. That's when we'll say that we have really come to the tipping point where it becomes part of the historical narrative that Africans came together and addressed a global injustice that was sort of constraining Africa's development. So just to finalize then, how do we clarify the manner in which resources are being siphoned out of the continent? Because research needs to do that for us. Clarify it better for us so that advocacy movements can begin to come up with policy asks to say, how do we stop it? Because at the moment, we are told that we're losing so much. And it's done in such a technical language, trade mispricing, tax evasion, etc. I'm not so sure if our advocates can come up with an advocacy agenda that responds to these things. And also, can we address some of the methodological contestations? We're not saying you should come to a consensus, but we should come to a place whereby we can move forward. We are in a gridlock around the contestations, around the formulas, how do we measure this, etc. And how do we make sure that the research that you generate beyond this initiative, all the research that you are carrying out, how do we make sure that it informs the advocacy agenda? And also to continue sustaining the campaign through generation of credible data and also creating scenarios. And I asked this question, and this is really like to poke at Briggs. Do we need a new movement against IFFs, or it needs to be on the platform of the broader economic justice movement? Because we do not want to seem to be creating another movement when we've already been discussing the issue to do with broader economic justice, but to highlight illicit financial flows as one of the big drivers that is causing this bleeding or that is causing the underdevelopment. I don't have much more to ask or to say, but just to wish you well in your deliberations. I have to be in another meeting. It's crazy. But anyway, I'll be in and out. But thank you so much for honoring the invitation and for being here. We do not take it lightly. We know you've got very busy schedules. And we are hoping that after this, we are going to have some credible research that will come out of these processes and take the way forward. Thank you very much.